In this video, we're going to meet some very famous philosophers, and we are talking about welfare analysis. So in one of the previous videos, we have talked about how economic efficiency can be looked at, can be analyzed in a competitive market. So in a market where government doesn't intervene, we can look at how much is the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, and that together gives the social surplus. And we can then also look at government interventions in that market and how that affects consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the overall size of the pie. Right? And if you remember well, in one of the last videos, we have seen that a government intervention through a price control, and the same would hold true for a quantity control or for a quantity restriction or a tax on the particular good, would actually reduce social efficiency. And that is an insight that goes back to long before we actually knew about supply and demand curves, but it goes back to the British philosopher Adam Smith in the 18th century, who postulated that that a competitive equilibrium, so a market where there is no intervention from the government, that actually maximizes the social efficiency. So on that market, the sum of consumer and producer surplus is maximized when there is no government intervention. So when we just leave the market to its own devices. Once again, does that mean we should not have a government at all? So is there such a thing as a free market in a state of anarchy? Well, probably not, right? Markets are the result of decisions of producers, of consumers, and they obviously need a legal framework, they need a currency, they need a lot of conditions need to be met for these markets and for all these transactions actually to take place. So a competitive or a free market does not mean a market that is completely devoid of institutions. It just means that the government doesn't intervene with the forces in that particular market. So either with the supply side or the demand side or both. Okay? And Adam Smith famously stated that social efficiency would be maximized if we leave markets then to their own devices. And that is even known as the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. And in the next couple of videos, we will revisit this theorem. But before we do that, we're going to look a little bit closer at how one can actually analyze the welfare of an entire economy, as in of an entire population of many people. You know, is there a way to actually do that? And if so, how? And one thing that comes up over and over again in the course, but not only in the course, also generally in the political debate, is the so-called equity and efficiency trade-off. So what that entails very much goes back to Adam Smith's first welfare theorem, which is that efficiency may imply that that implies that we maximize the social surplus, but that may also lead to a situation which you can see here on that big circle, where the pie is biggest, but it's very unequally distributed. And that a lot of societies, rightly so in my view, may not agree with that distribution. And the trade-off may be to have taxes and transfers, and in the view of Adam Smith, then have distortions in the market that leads to a shrinkage of the pie, but we have a more equal distribution. Right? And so when you follow the political debates in almost any country, whether it's in the US between Democrats and Republicans, or in Britain between Labour and the Conservatives, or in Germany or France or Ireland, wherever, you will typically have some people or some political groups that argue more on the pro-market side and say, oh, we should first of all care about how to maximize the size of the pie, whereas there are other parties or groups within parties that may favor a more equal distribution and oftentimes downplay or at least attach a lower weight to the size of the pie. Now, which of those is right? That is a question that is not one that we should answer in this course. Okay? What we should rather think about is, well, what are tools that we can use to analyze this trade-off and to analyze which societies may also place a different weight on equity or efficiency. There are some very clear examples. So the United States, by and large, tend to be, or in its tradition, tends to be a country that, or a society that places a lot of weight on efficiency, right? Free markets and, very little government intervention. The opposite end of the spectrum, there's also the usual suspects such as Sweden, Denmark, Norway that have a very strong redistribution. Not exactly small pies all the same, but I guess most people will agree that these societies in Scandinavia place a large weight on redistribution and on simply on equity. Okay, and so what we want to do now is we want to think about some very simple tools that allow us to analyze the weight societies place on equity versus efficiency. And the tool we use for that is one that most of you will probably not have heard, but is actually quite simple. And it's called the social welfare function. Now, what the social welfare function is basically one step up from a utility function. So remember, we had in one of the previous lectures or in the previous videos, we looked at the utility function, whereby the utility for that person is just a mapping of whatever that person consumes out of n types of goods that then maximizes that person's utility. And now we take the utility of each person in that society and aggregate that up to social welfare. Okay, so social welfare is the aggregate utility of an entire society. So of every person in that society taken together. And there are challenges with that. The biggest challenge is, it's easy to write down such a function, but the hard part here is to figure out what weight do societies attach to everyone's utility in the social welfare function. And if we want to go even a step further and think normatively, well, what weight should they attach? So there are obviously extreme views to say that everyone's utility should count the same, but I will show you that this is actually not a very extreme view, because in many states we have redistribution, and if you have a very strong redistribution, it is actually that it turns out that in the social welfare function of these states, people who are at the receiving end of redistribution, so those receiving the transfers, actually get a pretty high weight in the social welfare function. Okay, so let's think first about what that social welfare function actually is. So again, it's a it's a mapping of all the utilities of an entire society into one number. And the way it works is actually very similar to what we already know from utility maximization from a single customer. So here, what we maximize is not a person's utility, but a society's utility. And so we have then not individual indifference curves, but social indifference curves. So this is a simple example here with just two people in that society, A and B, right? And the government has to now decide what resources to give to each of those consumers, okay? And then what utility level to basically give that consumer. So here are just the ingredients that we need for this very, very simple analysis. So we have on the one hand social indifference curves, and again, the further we go away from the origin, the better. It's like with indifference curves, right? Because the further we come out here, the higher is the utility level that each of those two people gets, and that's good. But at the same time, within the possibilities for production in that economy, there is a boundary. There is a maximum of utility that we can give people, and that's called the utility possibility set. And that's the gray shaded area that you can see here. And it works pretty much the same as a budget set. So with the productive capacity in an economy, or with the potential for the economy to produce, you can of course go for an extreme case where person B gets everything and person A gets nothing, or the other extreme where A gets everything and B gets nothing, or somewhere in between. And so we typically have that as a convex set, those the utility possibility set, where again it's actually possible through somewhere in between to actually go beyond just a linear combination of those two extreme points. So that's the red point here. And so the goal for government should be to find the social optimum. And as with utility maximization, the social optimum here depends on the locus and shape of those indifference curves and the shape of the utility possibility set. And we will see that it doesn't always have to be so nice and symmetric. You could also think about, for example, it may be a lot easier with the same type of productive activity to give utility to person A rather than person B. Okay, and in that case, the utility possibility set would move out a good bit. Okay, and whether then the social optimum is still point A, or whether the social optimum is then rather some higher indifference curve, well, that remains to be seen. It depends on the shape of the indifference curves and the utility possibility set. Now, what is it with those indifference curves? Why are they so important here to look at? And why are they important as a tool for the analysis? They are so important because they represent social preferences. So they represent to what extent we can trade off my utility versus your utility, or the utility of people who are poor versus the utility of people who are rich, the utility of people who have very little economic possibility because they come from disadvantaged backgrounds, versus the utility of people who come from backgrounds where it's easy to thrive in life. And so how do we, what weights do we attach to the utilities of each of those groups? And there are two extreme cases for social preferences. The first one, you can see here, are so-called utilitarian preferences. So with utilitarian preferences, the utility of each person gets the same weight in that function. So whether one person owns everything or both own 50% each doesn't matter. The level of the overall social welfare in that society is the same in either case. Okay, so all agents get equal weight. Now, there is the other extreme by this gentleman up here, John Rawls, an American philosopher, who devoted pretty much his entire life to questions of social justice and optimal policy design. And the preferences that he came up with were named after him, are called Rawlsian preferences. And so these are the on the other end of the spectrum as opposed to utilitarian preferences, because here the overall social welfare is defined by the minimum utility in the entire society. So basically, the person in the society who gets the lowest level of utility has a weight that is 100%, and everyone else's weight in the social welfare function is 0. Right? And so basically, in the utilitarian case, we do not care whose gain it is. If we change policy, we don't care whether it is those people who are already rich who gain more, or whether it's the poor people. A gain is a gain. Whereas with Rawlsian preferences, we only consider a policy successful if the poorest individual in society gains. That is obviously a very radical view, but it's very, very useful to understand those two extremes, and then also understand the not so extreme cases that lie somewhere in between. So here you see the two of them graphed. Right? Now, the way you should think about this, first of all, why does this utility possibility set look so strange? Well, it looks so strange and is so skewed. It's obviously also to illustrate that both types of social preferences can lead to very, very different policies and different outcomes. So the way you should think about this skewed utility possibility set is as follows. Think about person A as coming from a background, from a social background that is conducive to doing very well in life. The family, they have the resources to teach them a lot as a child, and so to send them to the right schools, and then the right universities, and give them the right networks and so on. So the person, no matter how talented they are, they would just do very well in life. Okay? Whereas B might be someone from a very disadvantaged background, who, however hard they're gonna work, and they will probably not get that far because it's an uphill battle. Right? So then for person B, their maximum level of utility they can attain, or that they can attain within the society, is a lot less than the maximum level of utility for person A. Right? And now let's look at the optimal points the optimal distribution of utility between A and B that will come from those different preferences. So let me quickly zoom in here and just think for a second of what those preferences actually look like, because on the previous slide you've only seen them as formulae, and that may be a bit abstract. So the utilitarian preferences, they are simply, so again, that's just W social welfare equals UA plus UB. So then you have UB here, you have UA here, and so obviously UB equals W minus UA, so you have W here, and then you have a slope of -1. Okay, and so obviously the indifference curves would then be parallel, and they would simply be parallel straight lines. With the Raljian preferences, we have something different. Namely, we have that welfare equals the minimum of UA and UB. Okay, so they will look a lot different, the indifference curves. Namely, they are L-shaped. So they look like this. Now, why is that? The way to think about that is as follows. So suppose I'm at this level, I see 1. Okay, and I'm at this point here, at the kink point. Now, so here I have for that social welfare level, I have the minimum consumption of A and the minimum consumption of B. Both consume exactly the same amount. Now suppose I give A more now. So I leave the level of utility for B constant, but give A more. So I'm moving out here. So let's call this A and this B. But my utility level will not increase because all I care about is the person who has the least amount of utility. And because B's utility remains the same, whether I give A more or not doesn't change the social welfare. What I would need to do to raise welfare and to move to a different utility curve or indifference curve would be to move to point C and give both of them more in equal amounts. That's how one can conceptualize Raljian preferences. And when we use these two preferences, we will see that if a government can pick through redistribution any point in that utility possibility set by taxing people, by giving transfers, we will immediately see that we get very different outcomes. Okay, so with utilitarian preferences, remember these are the parallel indifference curves, we end up at a point A here, which is quite an extreme point. But that just with those parallel indifference curves is the one where the slope of the indifference curve is equal to the slope of the possibility set, as in we exhaust all our possibilities and we get to a utility level or a welfare level that is as high as possible. That's at point A. However, if the preferences are Raljian, remember, the best outcome is there actually to give the same to each person. Because if we give one person a little bit more than the other, that doesn't increase utility. Okay, so it's always so Raljian preferences, they always expand along a 45-degree line. Okay, because if I want to improve welfare, I have to give everyone the same additional amount. Okay, and so these L-shaped curves at the 45-degree line, they would there you would have the optimal point B here. Okay, so you would give to B and to A the same level of utility. Okay, and so what can this be used for? Again, we can think about the US and Sweden as two extreme cases. Now, am I saying here the US society have utilitarian preferences? No, but they're probably closer to utilitarian than in Sweden, right? And so for that reason, that the preferences of society in the US, or at least parts of society in the US, are closer to utilitarian, they will choose a point that maximizes efficiency, and that point may lead to a very unequal distribution of consumption and utility. Whereas a country where society places a huge value on equity, they will more likely choose a point that gives you more equity. Right? But then obviously most societies will lie somewhere in between. So you will have some societies that have social preferences that are not quite Rawlsian, but have, that may look a bit more like that, where it's very hard to trade off the utility of someone against the utility of someone else. So you care more for equity, whereas there may be other societies where the curvature may be a lot less, like the orange line here. It's not exactly a straight line, but the curvature is a lot lower. That is closer to utilitarian preferences, and so makes it easier to trade off the utility of one person versus the utility of another person. And so there basically the optimal policy is whichever makes the pie the largest. Right? So that this is a useful lens through which we can view government policy in different societies, but also in different, but we can also look at the political preferences across different groups within a society.